Thank you very much, everybody. I've been telling a couple folks that I've met that I've been meaning to get here for years, and so I'm so glad that I get to be with you all today. As you heard, I am one of the co-founders of Represent the San Francisco Peninsula. That's our local chapter of Represent Us. You can find them on the internet at represent.us. That's where their name comes from. And the thing that you should, now I get to find out if my slide changer works. Not like that. The thing that's most important to know about Represent Us is that we have a clear and simple message, and that is to make the purchase of political influence illegal. We're not about partisan politics. We're about democracy, and in a democracy, one should not be able... My slides are... I'm getting a little... I'm sorry. Hold on just a sec. Yeah. I hope that keeps working. In a democracy, one should not be able to buy a politician the way we buy a new set of bed sheets.
Great.
It's not working. Another thing that you should know about us is, I'm very proud of this incidentally, but I have learned that this is definitely not everybody's cup of tea, but we are not only a national grassroots organization, but we are firmly committed to being cross-partisan. And when we say that, we mean it. We team up with everybody from the far left to the far right, from the Tea Party to Occupy, and we all work together on this narrow patch of common ground, which is to make the purchase of political influence illegal. In fact, one of our favorite, it worked, one of our favorite slogans, I'm sorry you can't see the whole thing on this slide, is to fight corruption, not one another. That's the end of my introduction. This presentation is in 3 parts. We want to first take a look at the nature of the problem itself and then get into what we believe is the best solution for responding to what this problem is really all about, and then our strategy for making our solution work. And finally, my very favorite part, when we'll turn this over to you for your own insights and observations, comments, questions. If I forget to remind you at the end, let me remind you now that we want to be able to hear everybody's voice. And so we'll ask you to call for that microphone and someone will get it right to you. So my guess is no one here, no one who's been paying attention is going to be surprised to learn that the cost of running for political office has just escalated over the past couple of decades to the point where the cost of running for the Senate is now up by 62%, and the cost of running for the House is up by a whopping 344%. Now, this is partly because of the cost of media for political advertising. We know that. But to a large chunk of this cost is actually about intel gathering. So they use very sophisticated marketing techniques developed by the big firms like Nielsen and Claritas. Claritas and their PRISM program have us all divided into about, I think it's about 66 different groups. Narrow demographic groups with these interesting names describing the people in those groups. And this information tells them really kind of creepy things about us all. They know what restaurants you want to go to, what kind of car you want to drive, what TV shows you're inclined to watch, where you want to be on a Sunday morning. They know this about us. And as a result, they can coach politicians on exactly what to say to reach different demographic groupings, exactly what words will trigger feelings of hope, optimism, fear, anger, and they use it. And this is really important to politicians because 93% of the time, the candidate with the most money wins. And this kind of fine-tuning of how to spend that money in a way that lets you frame your message for particular people is what does that. So let's talk about how much money we're talking about. The average cost in 2014, that's the most recent year we have stats for, the average cost of running for the House is up to $1.2 million, and the average cost of running for the Senate is up to $8.6 million. And when you start playing around with those figures, you discover that that means if you are a member of the House of Representatives, you will have to raise at least $50,000 every single month you're in office in order to run for re-election. And if you're a member of the Senate, that jumps to just under $120,000. It's obscene. And no wonder then that we're constantly hearing that our elected representatives now spend between 30 and 75% of their time raising money. Because when you have that kind of monthly figures to make, it doesn't just happen on its own. And that may be why, instead of our Congress members working together to debate and deliberate public policy the way the founders wrote about, instead of that, you turn on C-SPAN and see they are giving their speeches to empty chambers. And then if you keep watching C-SPAN, you'll see them eventually call a roll call vote. They all come rushing back in from their offices where I suppose they've been dialing for dollars. So let's talk about who it is that's coming up with the money for all of this. To begin with, 90% of Americans have never given one thin dime to any politician, party, political campaign, or PAC. Nothing. And of the 10% that do, the number of people that give at a level over the FEC's $200 guideline, the Federal Elections Commission has this bar, and if you're giving more than that amount of money, that's when they have to start tracking the contribution, and we know something about those donors. But an infinitesimally small number of people actually contribute over $200. In fact, the New York Times had a fascinating article in October that you may have seen. They have narrowed this down to 158 families who are doing most of the funding for our elections. You can, if you missed it, you can still see it online. Google New York Times 158. It'll come up. So it's this underlying structure of how much money is needed and then who is providing the money that is so undermining of democracy itself. To begin with, I brought this example of what I mean by this kind of corruption. Researchers at Yale University working with researchers at UC Berkeley discovered that, their experiment was they sent out invitations to an event to 191 members of Congress. And half of these invitations, half the member of Congress, got an invitation that appeared to come from members of their local constituency. And the other half got an invitation that appeared to come from active political donors. So they're invited to some, reception or whatever. And the group that got the invitation from their so-called donors were 4 times as likely to attend the event. 4 times more likely to attend that event. And, what's horrifying is part of me kind of understands it. If you've got to spend so much of your time fundraising and there's only so much time in the day, you kind of have to figure out ways to double task and make things you do into fundraising events. So I sort of get it, but it's still horrifying. There's no way to sugarcoat it. This is telling us that money buys access in Washington. And the story gets worse. This was a study, a very rare study, because it was a longitudinal study done over a 20-year period. And what they did here was, again, I guess my slides are coming out a little bit low on our hookup, but on that x-axis across the bottom, they looked at 20 years of polling data on public opinion, on any kind of issue you could imagine. Public opinion on Second Amendment rights, or on a woman's rights to choose, or on immigration policy, whatever you want. It runs along that x-axis at the bottom from nobody cares about that issue all the way to 100%. Everybody's screaming about it. And then the y-axis running up and down shows the likelihood that Congress actually took action on this issue over this 20-year period. And in a perfect democracy, you would expect the correlation of these two frames to be that gray diagonal line that runs from nobody cares about this issue and Congress doesn't do anything about it, to the more people care, the more Congress is likely to act. That's what an ideal democracy would look like, but that is not what they found. Instead, the results are that almost flat purple line at the 30% likelihood level. In other words, the amount of people that wanted something done had basically no influence at all. No influence at all. This was a 2014 study. It's called the Princeton study, if you want to Google that and learn more about it. And it was covered by all the papers. So this might sound familiar to you. And usually the headline said, "The United States is now officially an oligarchy." Because that's what this implies. If you look at this next slide, you'll see the 2 subgroups that differed. One was if you looked at what the economic elites wanted, and the second, what the special interest groups wanted. And in both cases, those lines approach that ideal democracy line. The more people want it, the more that line goes up. That's oligarchy, that's not democracy. So the sad truth is that between the money it takes to run for re-election and the money you're expected to raise for your political party, and not only your own fundraising, because you also have a monthly contribution, a monthly quota to meet for your political party. Between all of that, I claim that we could send Mr. Smith back to Washington, and he is going to be just as vulnerable to these same pressures. The problem is not in the people, the problem is in the system, and it corrupts the system itself. So when liberals talk about corruption, they're usually talking about the kind of corruption that Larry Lessig writes about in his book, Republic Lost. Really good book to read, incidentally. They're talking about bribery. Now, not the quid quo pro bribery that got Rod Blagojevich in so much trouble years ago when he tried to sell Obama's Senate seat. Remember that? That is illegal. He did go to prison for that. But it isn't illegal to accept huge sums of money from very wealthy individuals like the Koch brothers or George Soros or Sheldon Adelson, Sidney Adelson, blanking out on that name. It isn't illegal to accept huge sums of money from big corporations, big oil, or the pharmaceutical industry, or big labor, or Monsanto. None of that is illegal. It's not illegal to accept a whole bunch of money from lobbyists. Or, of course, lobbyists can do it all sorts of ways. They don't just write you a check for your campaign. They can volunteer to hold the fundraiser. They can offer you a really high-paying, mega million-dollar salary job after you leave Washington. And why wait for that? We can offer this job to your spouse or one or more of your adult kids right now. That'll work. And it isn't illegal to accept huge sums of money from super PACs with these very deceptive names. You can't tell who they really are. You know, like my very, very favorite one of all, which is Patriotic Americans for a More Patriotic and American America. So good.
The Tea Party.
Now, when conservatives talk about corruption, they're not looking at the bribery side of things. They call it extortion. And incidentally, that's another really good book to read if you want the conservative viewpoint on this. The author, Peter Schweizer, he reminds us of cases like the one right here in our own Silicon Valley, where, you know, the high-tech industry here originally tried very hard to stay out of politics. They just wanted to innovate and make great products that everybody around the world would just love. But by 2011, Washington found ways to let the high-tech industry know that you have to play along to get along in this country. And they did that primarily through the use of what's known as a double milker bill. Now, a single milker bill, that's a very simple process whereby a member of Congress will introduce some legislation which, if passed, would potentially hurt the profits of some deep pocket industry group. And then they contact people in that industry for their fundraising call and happen to mention that this legislation is coming up, and if they could just get this fundraising thing out of the way, they could address this, you know, trying to fight this thing from happening. And Schweitzer says that's extortion. That's like telling me I have to pay protection money from our elected representatives, or I'm going to wake up with a horse head in my bed or something. See, so that's how a milker bill works. And then there's the double milker bill, and this one is clever. This is when you propose legislation that helps one big money group and would hurt another. So now you've got two industries trying to outspend each other to win your vote, either to pass it or defeat the legislation. And in 2011, it was a double milker bill that was aimed at the high-tech industry, pitting them against another big money group, older, more established, Hollywood. And the issue, yeah, you're remembering this now, it wasn't that long ago, the issue was internet piracy. And Joe Biden and Barack Obama would be flying out to the San Francisco area in the morning, and they were holding town hall meetings with Facebook employees up in Palo Alto, and then they would get back on Air Force One and jet back down to Southern California, and they'd have these big celebrity fundraisers while they meet with the Hollywood executives. And in 1 month alone, in April of 2011, all that work brought in $12.4 million to the Democratic National Committee. And the thing with all this is, I think increasingly we are all becoming cows in this same barn. I have noticed when I'm online, if I sign any petition about any given wedge issue or otherwise let my political beliefs be known, I will then be deluged over the next couple of weeks for urgent appeals to send in my $3, my $15, whatever, to support or defeat some horrible thing that's about to happen. And most of these horrible things that are about to happen are in fact milker bills. They are not intended to go anywhere. It is the congressional version of street theater. So extortion or bribery, call it what you want, but the most important thing to know about corruption is that Americans are sick of it. This is some really interesting polling data that was commissioned by Represent Us in 2013 when we were just getting underway and we wanted to know what the political landscape was like. And here's one of the key questions that the polling company asked. They asked people if they would support or oppose a federal law that imposed anti-corruption laws on politicians, lobbyists, and super PACs. And look at those numbers, 97.3%. 7.3% said they would support this. People often ask me, well, so what about the remaining 2.7%? And, I don't know. So when someone asks me a question like that, I just make up an answer, and I tell them that could be, the people that are benefiting from the status quo, those big special interest groups and mega wealthy people. It could represent them. They should be represented if the poll was done right. And, the only other idea I have is that maybe there are people who aren't getting enough fiber in their diet. But I don't know. The thing is that they then asked this question a second time during this survey, except this time they started to spell out the details. And they included what we were actually going to put into the American Anti-Corruption Act. So they said, would you support or oppose a piece of federal legislation if it prohibited politicians from taking campaign money from the industries they regulate? There's a good idea. Would you support it if it also was putting tough limits on unregulated super PACs, increasing transparency for campaign funding, empowering the voters to put as much money in as these private groups are doing through some public campaign financing legislation, reducing the influence of big money in our elections, and getting a lot tougher with these groups when they are breaking even the current laws that are already on the books, if this legislation had real teeth in it. And you would expect, once you actually have the details up there, that the polling numbers, would drop, because the devil's in the detail. And when you tell people, do you love your mother, you get one thing, and then it's, well, what if your mother were? And, so you would expect the numbers to drop once you see the details, and they did drop, but these are still astronomical. That number of who would support this is still at 87.9%. You never see those kinds of numbers in politics. In fact, one of our pollsters himself said, I've never seen such high numbers, such high levels of support for an initiative. It would be virtually impossible to lose. Well, that's encouraging. So, we know what the people want. We know what our system needs. We need a comprehensive solution to this problem. One of the mistakes we've been making is we focus just on pieces of it. You close off one door and another door opens and they all go over there. So we need a piece of legislation that will really take on all 360 degrees of this problem. We need one that isn't going to be overturned by the Supreme Court, because what would be the point of doing all that work if the Supreme Court just declares it to be unconstitutional? We need something we can all get behind. As I said earlier, we are fiercely cross-partisan. If this solution is only something that progressives want and conservatives don't want it, or vice versa, it's not the right solution for America. We need a strategy that doesn't depend on a dysfunctional Congress to pass it. Now, that one is tricky, but we know that members of Congress could not vote for this right now because they would lose all their funding if they did. That's too high a price to pay. So we need to figure out how to get around that one. We need to empower the voters by making citizen funding competitive with the money that's coming in from the special interest groups and the mega wealthy. And we need to find ways to break that tie between money in politics and policy making itself. We can't get rid of money in politics because that would be unconstitutional. So Represent Us, working primarily under the leadership of Trevor Potter. You may recognize that name. He is a Republican and a former chair of the Federal Elections Commission. So the guy really knew what he was doing, and he gathered up, I think it was 24 constitutional law attorneys to help with this, and then a lot of grassroots activists from all parts of that political spectrum, and they got together and came up with step one, the real solution to corruption, the American Anti-Corruption Act. You can read this act online. It's about 11 pages long. It's written mostly in English. You know, there's a legal line here and there, but nothing you can't interpret if you just give it maybe a second reading. But most of it is very, very direct and easy to read. And step two was then to create the political power to take this on. So that's when they started forming chapters of Represent Us around the country. We have 6 such chapters in California now. And our role is not only to go out and advocate for this and educate our neighbors about what this is, but also to put this on the ballot directly in front of the voters. And that's how we get around Congress. We have the voters themselves vote for this at the city level, the state level, and so forth. And what we're putting on the ballot, we've already been talking about some of the specifics. It can be most easily seen in terms of 4 blocks: stopping bribery in all its various disguises, putting people over PACs by looking at how the money comes into Washington and what it can and cannot do, ending any kind of secret money, so it includes full transparency issue, and finally, this was Trevor Potter's big deal, it has to have real teeth in it to enforce it. So it can't just be something that's, you know, a great idea that just collects dust on the shelf. So step 3 has to do with our work locally. As I said, we try to get this on the ballot directly in front of the people. And in our first year of doing this, that was just last year, we won by landslide numbers everywhere we went. The very first one was Tallahassee, Florida, and it was because we worked cross-partisanly. This was put on the ballot by a coalition that included the Democratic Party, the Tea Party, and the League of Women Voters. Hard to fight that kind of coalition. I think of that as our secret sauce. We also won in Princeton, New Jersey that year. We won in Ewing Township, New Jersey, in 2 congressional districts in Massachusetts, plus Cambridge. We won in Cambridge. I don't think that's up there. Genoa, Illinois, Denton, Texas, a couple places all over the country, mostly east of the Mississippi, and then the West started getting on board. And this year, just a couple weeks ago, less than a couple weeks ago, we won every place we were on the ballot again. We had a major victory in Maine. Again, working with a coalition that was across the board. In Maine, they passed their Clean Elections Act, which was mostly designed to strengthen some previous legislation they had that did not have enforcement teeth into it. So they won in Maine by 55%. In Ohio, this is cool. They amended their state constitution to forbid any kind of partisan gerrymandering of their state districts, and they won by another landslide, 73%. It was so big that they already are starting to work on a new piece of legislation that will do the same for their congressional districts. In Seattle, I love this story. They won by a 2-to-1 margin, and they face some of the fiercest competition we've seen yet. Seattle is another major city, and they faced opposition that included the Seattle Times that came out against the anti-corruption legislation, and also the Koch brothers. They came to town to and put their money into fighting it, but shoot, we won. And then just up the road in San Francisco, the Represent Us chapter up there are their friendly faces. They worked with their city's ethics commission to pass Prop C by another landslide, almost 75% of the vote, 74.8. So, as we do this, that's how the voices of the people are heard in Washington. This is actually modeled on the marriage equality movement, and then to some extent also on the legalized marijuana movement, that you let the people have their say in the polls, and then Washington sees the writing on the wall. And we've seen how, in both of those cases, how quickly those politicians flipped around when the people started voting for themselves on these issues. So that's the heart of our strategy. And I'm hoping that at least some of you in this room would be willing to help. Now, I understand that you might be hearing about Represent Us for the first time and that you're humanist, and that means you want to think about it. But that's a good thing, right? And you want to read more about it and find out more, but you're going to like what you see. And so I want to tell you about the various ways you can help us out. First of all, you can take the postcards that I've got up on this table here, because that'll give you some more information, and then you can pass them on. You know, Thanksgiving's coming up, and many of you will be with families, including, you know, that cousin. So pass this stuff on, have the conversations, and take my card. On my business card, which is also up here, you'll get the URLs for everything, for Represent Us, and where you can read about the Anti-Corruption Act, and where you can find our Facebook page and always hear about what we're up to. You can help us make connections to other groups, other people, civic leaders, celebrities. A lot of people do know celebrities, even though you all look pretty normal. And it would really help our national organization to be able to have those kind of introductions made for us. We're also very close to starting a new chapter in San Jose, and that's super important to us. San Jose is actually the second largest city in California. We need a chapter. And then have conversations with your family, friends, neighbors, coworkers about anti-corruption issues and this particular approach. Help us spread the word on this. Because if we fix corruption, we can fix anything. And I am so convinced that we are stronger together. One of the real blessings for me in this process is to learn to work with people whose politics are different than my own, and to learn from them. They actually have a lot to bring to the table as well. And we're really best when we work things out in a way that covers all the bases well for everybody. And we can, when there's real respect for one another. This country cannot afford to remain so polarized. So thank you for your attention, and I hope that you'll share your thoughts about this presentation. Just remember to ask for that mic.
I'll just comment. I'm sure everybody knows Trevor Potter. He was Colbert's attorney for his super PAC. And so I'll bring the mic around, and I'll try to do it in the order I see the hands, but I may do it somewhat out of order sometimes just for convenience. If you would say your name first, that would be helpful.
Hi, my name is Byron. You mentioned several times having teeth in proposed legislation or enforcement. How is enforcement going to be imposed? Is it litigation? Are there criminal penalties?
Yeah.
How will that work?
There are criminal penalties. There are also very stiff fines. There's a reporting system. It's really ironclad. In fact, after they finished writing this, they tested it out on the most famous, maybe the word is infamous, lobbyist of all time, and that is Jack Abramoff, who actually went to prison for his stuff and came out He tells us a reformed man. He is on our board. He took a look at this act and pronounced it bulletproof.
Next question, please.
Okay, hi. I had a question. I don't know whether you know the answer to it or not. But when the Supreme Court allowed Citizens United, the problem was that they couldn't demonstrate the fact that money impacted the political outcome. So what happened that they didn't see this 93%? I'm trying to understand. Was it just poor attorney, whatever, something like that? If you know anything about it, I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, I don't know anyone who sits on the court, and I would love to find out what was actually going on. So I guess as a default, I kind of believe what I read, which is the Supreme Court wasn't ruling on a case, they were making law. They were out of role, and they did what they wanted to do, in spite of the facts. But I don't actually have any inner knowledge about that.
And it wasn't 100%. It wasn't 100%. Not all the justices went for it.
Absolutely right. It was not. It was a 5-4. Yeah.
Other questions or comments? Let me ask, while we're waiting for other questions, you indicated that there would be a San Jose chapter established. Could you tell us any specifics about that, how persons here could get involved?
Yeah, we've been giving a lot of presentations recently, and that's drawn some people out, including some young adults, one of whom said, I want to volunteer, but I live in San Jose, and another said, I'd love to start a chapter where I live, which is San Jose. So we said, let's get you guys together. And since then, because this is a very internet-driven movement, we've been rounding up all the people that have come to the website and said, I'm interested in giving us a zip code. And so it turns out we've got a lot of people in San Jose who are ready to at least consider working on something. So our Represent Us national staff is talking to those folks and trying to get them started, and we will be their big sister chapter, and we'll help them in any way we can.
Hi, Helen.
We need a microphone, please.
Hi, I'm Helen Athey. I'm interested in how you coordinate with getting rid of ALEC, which has a major influence. They're more, of course, into the actual policy writing, but there is some money involved in how they get away with what they're doing.
Yeah, ALEC is good. I don't know. This is what I know about ALEC. If we sign online petitions to get laws passed and stuff, we're kind of spitting in the wind because, as we saw in the Princeton study, Congress doesn't listen to the will of the people. But when we sign online petitions for commercial ventures, for public consumer stuff, they often work, and they have been really effective in getting companies like Coca-Cola and many others to drop out of ALEC. So that's a strategy that does seem to be working. When we threaten boycotts against the members of ALEC, we have a pretty good success record. I'm not saying we Represent Us, because Represent Us is not working on this, but we, consumers of America, have a pretty good track record in getting folks to drop out of ALEC. They are one sneaky group. What our American Anti-Corruption Act would do, however, is prohibit any lobbyist group from giving money to a member of Congress who sits on a committee that regulates that industry. So it kind of takes the fun out of making political donations if it's not going to get you anything in return.
But that still gets office next door from them. So.
That's right. ALEC is a sort of stealth organization, and they work at other levels besides the federal government, and they're all too effective. We really need to get something national going that's really taking direct aim at them.
Arthur Jackson here. Very exciting to be here. You're a fantastic speaker, and you speak so well and so grounded, and this is just a thing. And the wonderment is that underneath all these labels, Republican, whatever, there are human beings with real concerns and interests and desires to get rid of the tragedy we've allowed to come into our system. So I hope that the humanist community can be a supporting person for this new chapter, because we are trying to move more into that in that direction, and I'm certainly going to do what I can to help support it. And thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you too. And the humanist community really could be a very special partner to an effort like this, because you're all over the country and you're folks that understand what social justice really means, what living a moral life really is about.
I'm Sherry Long, and I'm wondering, although I've heard that this one and that one belongs to ALEC, how do you find out all of the people all of the companies that belong to ALEC?
You know, I actually was asked to make up a list for something else I was working at one point, and I just found out on the internet. Just Google companies who are part of ALEC, and a good list comes up. I can't tell you whether it's complete. I hope it was. It was a very long list.
Hi, my name is Rick Thomas. I was wondering, I've heard that a lot of corporations are actually like writing the bills, 99% of the bill, and then handing it to their representative to put it in. Is that something you're going to try to address with Represent Us?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that one. So I'm going to find out, because you're right. This is really about looking at the money side of things. But you're totally right. That's the big flaw with looking at term limits for these folks, is that incoming members of Congress are super dependent on lobbyists to sort of be their staff extenders and educate them about the issues and write those bills. And I'll look into it. Now you got me curious. Thank you for that. Good thing to raise.
I'm Steve Piazzali, and during the Republican debates this last week, they interviewed Donald Trump, and they asked him something about whether he felt pressure from different groups, and he says, "I don't feel pressure from anybody. I'm totally funding my own campaign." And my first reaction was, "That's good." But then I thought, is it good? So I was wondering your take. If somebody's rich enough to run independent, in other words, whatever they're saying is what you're going to get, unless they're just directly lying. Is that a good thing or is not?
A lot of people really like Donald Trump for that point of view. And what's the concern that goes along with that point of view? Anybody want to do this one for me? It kind of says only the rich get to run for office. So, it's just another form of the oligarchy.
Also, I would say he's looking out.
Wait for the mic, Carol.
Just off the top of my head, the other thing is that he would clearly, he has many, many business interests all over the world. So the fact that he's making his own decisions and he's still going to be influenced by how a decision will affect his business interests. So.
Being influenced by his own money.
Exactly.
That's right.
Well, the solution that some states like Maine are working on, and Arizona too, I believe, is that the state gives you a certain amount of money to all of them, and you cannot spend more than that. You can't use your own money, you can't take money, you just use that money.
Thank you for that. I like that.
Do you want to talk about the publicly financed part?
Jim Naylor, I have two questions. First, do you think you can arouse the apathy of the American electorate? And second, wouldn't it be possible to utilize these large corporations who are being extorted to support your movement?
Yeah. That's exactly right. It's one of the reasons that conservatives do support the movement. I don't know about the corporations. They're a part of the oligarchy and being well served by it, as we know. The 200 most politically active corporations over the past 5-year period contributed a total of $4.8 billion to political campaigns. And in return, I'm glad you're all sitting, well, most of you are sitting down. In return, they got, I'm sorry, I had that number wrong. They contributed $5.8 billion, and in return, they got $4.4 trillion in government subsidies and tax breaks and the like. And, I don't work with large numbers like that, so I actually had to look up what $1 trillion is, and it turns out that you could spend $1 million a day every single day. I'm not sure what you would be spending it on, because that's more than you need to buy a Supreme Court justice and a couple senators, but you could spend $1 million a day every single day since the birth of Jesus, and you would still have a couple $1 billion left to play around with today. So it's working really well for the corporations. And Carol was asking me if I should say something more to you all about our version of public financing of elections, because we had to work this out with those on the right side of center, and they had real issues with public financing of elections. They call it things like welfare for politicians, and they are having none of it. But we have to work together. So our approach is to give a $100 tax rebate to voters that they can then spend on the candidate of their choice. So no one gets to say, my tax dollars are going to some place where I don't want them to go. They cannot spend the rebate, that's okay too, but if they want to be part of this, they can direct it to the candidate of their choice. Now the candidate can't use that money unless they don't use private money. And if you do the math, and I did the math, it's a really big pot of money, and it comes with that nice good housekeeping seal of approval that you are for anti-corruption. If you take private money instead, that would become a campaign issue very quickly.
There's always been a box on a 1040 form. Do you want $1? To go to that? But this is something where you would say. And that just goes to the federal election campaign. It doesn't go to a particular candidate. So what you want to do is make it so you could say, earmark it for this candidate.
That's right. It goes to a candidate, not a party, and it goes to the candidate of your choice.
Is it possible to limit the amount of money a politician could spend on their campaign? I believe Australia does have some sort of limit, don't they?
Yeah, I've heard good things about what's happening in Australia too, but I'm not an expert on it. Right now, the Supreme Court has defined money as speech, and we can't do anything about that. We're not going to start restricting First Amendment rights. That's what the conservatives start screaming about very, very quickly. But what we can do, and I want to emphasize this, we can break the tie between that money and the policy making itself.
Is it possible to give a set amount of money, like subsidized by the government, so they don't have to get it from a corporation?
Yep.
So instead of just setting a limit on how much you could get.
That is absolutely. Oh, can we cap the amount that a politician can take?
Give each candidate X amount of dollars, so they all have the same amount of money.
We can do that. What we can't do is prevent them from taking money from some other group or person in addition to that, because that would be restricting their First Amendment free speech rights. As long as money is speech, we're stuck with that one.
But with this proposal you guys have, would that be part of it, is giving them money from the government?
Yeah, it doesn't restrict them from the other money. It just leaves it up to them. They can choose one or the other. So we're not stepping on their First Amendment rights that way. It's a workaround solution. Carol.
No, she just...
Hi. The poll that you mentioned about public attitudes towards corruption. Yeah. Do you have any idea what the sample size was on that poll?
I do not. I could find out for you. Take my card and remind me, and I can find out. Okay. But it was a statistically significant sample size. Okay. This was done by a professional organization.
Close enough.
My name's Hilton Brown, and this is related to your topic, I think, but not really on it. I have made the error several years ago of making my name known to a lot of political organizations, a lot of other people, and I get emails now. It says, from Robert, and it says, we are in desperate need of more money, and we have we have a 5-to-1 grant that if you just send it in, and they don't even tell me anymore who it is that they are supporting with this thing. Is there any way of approaching the problem of an email? The subject of an email has to be a subject.
Anyone in the room want to take that one on? Because I'm just
about this?
Oh, it's too familiar.
I can answer that slightly. Most emails, and I'm sort of in the same state as you are, and you subscribe to one like change.org, and before you know it, 6 months later, you're on 20 lists. A lot of emails that come from political organizations, especially asking for money, at the very bottom in the smallest possible font, there will be an unsubscribe link. And all you have to do is usually click that, and it will send an email and say, why do you want to unsubscribe? And you don't even have to answer it. You just say unsubscribe.
Very small print, but
very
it's
small,
there.
and you have to be very persistent.
Or it may have come from a middle-sized town in a small country in West Africa.
So the generic term is corruption. And yet I see two significantly socially different sources. There is people, that's us. There's rich people, that's still us. And then there's corporate interest. I did not see any dissociation between those two from Represent Us. Are we against rich people, or are we against corporate interest, or both?
Thank you for that. We're against corruption. And really, that's the interest. There are wonderful rich people. There are corporations doing amazingly wonderful things. That's not our fight.
Yeah, another comment. I think somebody was mentioning, I think the state of Arizona has an equal balance. Someone was asking a question about that, where if one candidate, if you agree to accept no money from an outside source, in Arizona, they will, every time the other candidate gets money, you get an equal amount, comes out of the Treasury. Anyway, and supposedly that works. That's why there's been so much of a radical change in Arizona politics, my understanding. Has not been defeated in the Supreme Court? I do not know. Does anybody know? Hold it.
Yes, I knew about that public financing, and somehow, and I don't know, and it would be a good question to research, but I was talking to a politician who had been elected under that system, and she said she could no longer afford to do it because the Supreme Court had gutted it in some way. The Arizona Supreme Court had gutted it in some way, and I don't know more than that, but it would be worth researching.
Well, they were doing it in Maine, too. I wonder if that would apply to them. When you said that they've ruled money as free speech, maybe that does mean that it's illegal to tell them they can't throw in extra money.